Good morning, everybody. My name is Melanie Panino. I'm with the PMZ office in Lodi, and today we're going to go over the residential purchase agreement. Usually when I do this class, I have you do a homework assignment and fill out the purchase agreement, but for this purpose, we're going to skip that. But you might want to pause this video and actually print out a copy of the purchase agreement so you have it to look at while we're going through our presentation. So the first thing I want to tell you is that you need to do is read the contract. Very important, whether you're a new person or someone that's been in the business for a while. You really need to know what you're filling out. The contract is one of the most important documents we use in our business, and you need to know what it says. We tend to only pay attention to the paragraphs that have a fill in the blank spot, but there's other important information that you need to know and your clients need to know in paragraphs that don't have anything to fill in. So make sure that you sit down and read the contract. Another piece of advice I give you is when you're going to be meeting with your client to fill this contract out, you've been out showing property and they found their dream home and they want to write it up right now. My advice is tell them to go to Starbucks or go have lunch or go do something else, and take a few minutes at your office to fill this contract out yourself. There may be things that you need to finish later when you actually have them in front of you, but fill out the majority of it before you start have them sitting in front of you, because they're excited and they're asking you questions and you may skip something that's really important that you need to fill in. So my advice is take 30 minutes or however long you think it's going to take you to get this contract started before you actually have the people sitting in front of you. So we're going to start and go over the purchase contract. Like I said, this would normally have been a homework assignment and you would have something that filled this in. But we're going to go over the basic tenets of the contract, and you might have some questions. My name and phone number and email was on the first slide, so feel free to contact me, or I know there's going to be a meetup at the end of the week, so you can also ask questions then. So the first thing is you have to put the date in, you have to put your buyer in. Now, if you're new and you haven't had the Zip Forms class yet, you can use a program called MLS Connect. And if you use MLS Connect, it will make your life a lot easier. It will automatically fill in a lot of the pertinent information on the property for you, like the address, the zip code, the other agent's info, those kinds of things. So if you use MLS Connect, it'll fill in a lot of those blanks. You can also do templates, which you'll learn in the Zip Forms class. It can also make your life a lot easier by filling in items that you normally always fill in the same way on a contract every time. So stay tuned for that class. So first off, we're going to fill in our buyer's name. If we've used MLS Connect, it's already filled in for us, name and the address of the property. So we're going to fill in the purchase price. And then you need to fill in a close of escrow date. A contract has to have a begin date and an end date. So never leave that date blank. What you want to do is make sure that your lender can comply with the date you want to put in there. So if you want to put in, let's say you're going to be in multiple offers and you want to put in 20 days instead of 30 days, you better talk to the lender and make sure that they can accommodate that time frame. Otherwise, you're going to be putting your clients in a position where they can't perform on the contract, and that's a whole nother issue. The next part is agency. So when you get this form in Zip Forms, there's a lot of auxiliary forms that come in that package. An agency, a possible representation form, a lot of other forms. But we're only dealing with this contract form today. You need to have confirmation of agency. That's part of the agency law. So you have to have disclosure, you have to have confirmation. So you need to fill in who represents who. So you know who you are. So you're going to fill in who you are. But never, ever, ever, ever leave the seller's brokerage firm blank. You are out there at the house with the sign in the yard, and you have the printout from MLS. You know who the office is and who the realtor is. So you need to make sure that you fill that in and you check the appropriate box. Okay, so in this example, PMZ is representing both parties, but should it not be that way, one person represents the seller and one person represents the buyer. If you're a dual agent, if it's a PMZ listing and you're a PMZ agent, it's going to be PMZ is going to represent both the buyer and the seller. That's called dual agency, and you have to disclose that. If you don't fill this out or fill it out incorrectly, you'll have to do a form to correct that information. And the people that do the sky slope checking will make you do that so that you can get your check. So you're going to, next is the finance terms. So you're going to put in an initial deposit. That deposit is not the total deposit the buyer's going to put down. This is what's called the good faith deposit or the earnest money deposit. And if you want to make your offer look more attractive, if you know you're going to be in a multiple offer situation, which is happening a lot now, you could make that number, you could beef that number up and make it a lot more. So when I first started in the business a long time ago, the deposit was $500. So, but don't do that now. So, usually it's at least several $1,000s. So you want to that's one way you can make your offer more attractive over another offer. It is the amount that your buyer would risk should they default on the contract, down the road. So if you're most times now that deposit is made by electronic transfer, but if you're going to take a check, you need to check the box in 3A2, and the check should be made to the title company. Not to PMZ. PMZ does not maintain at any office that I'm aware of a trust fund account where we put the buyer's deposit in there and then we deposit it. We send a check to title. If you do take an actual check for this deposit, it's going to be made to whatever title company you're planning on using. Then you're going to go down. If it's an all cash offer, obviously you're going to check that box. And otherwise, you're going to fill in the loan information. So under D1, there's information you need to fill in there. Is it an FHA loan? Is it a VA loan? Are you asking for seller financing? And then fill in the blank, say this loan is going to be at a fixed rate not to exceed. You should put something in there. So let's say we know rates now are, 2 something. You might put 3 in there. It is a not to exceed. It gives your buyer a way to get out of the contract should something go wonky and rates go sky high and they're like, I don't want to buy a house at this rate. That gives them a reason to get out of the contract. And that goes for as well the next blank where it says the points shall not exceed X. If they can get 0 points, great. This is a not to exceed amount. And so when you're explaining this to your buyer, make sure you say, this isn't the rate you have to get. This is a not to exceed amount. This is a protection for you, because what if you can get, in this case, what if you can get 5%, but you have to pay 5 points? That's a lot of money someone's going to be putting up. So we don't want to obligate the buyer to that. So that's a way. So if you're, you have to figure out what your loan amount is going to be. You can lean on the lender for that. And then now that if you put in the amount you're going to offer and you put in all the pertinent amount, the deposit, the loan amount, it will actually figure out the balance of the down payment, and you do not have to do any 5th grade math for that. So that brings you down to the bottom. Make sure the buyer's initial. Next page, verification of down payment and closing costs. This says that within 3 days after acceptance, you're going to give them a verification of down payment and closing costs, or you can check the box that says verification is attached, which again, if you're trying to make your offer look better than any of the other 10 offers that are out there, you might want to attach that with with your offer. Appraisal and contingency removal. The pre-printed days is 17 days. You could make it shorter, you could make it longer. You need to talk with your lender again and make sure that they can accommodate being able to get the appraisal and get it back within the 17 days. This is especially important if you plan on shortening up the escrow. You're going to have to shorten this day as well. Next part talks about loan application. It says within 3 days after acceptance, the buyer is going to give the seller a letter. Well, in this day and age, you shouldn't be making an offer without having that pre-qualification letter in your hand ready to send with your offer, because your offer will just not get any look if you send it without a pre-qualification letter. So you should check the box that says letter attached. The third part of that is the loan contingency removal. That pre-printed days is 21 days. So within 21 days after acceptance, you're going to have the appraisal and everything on the loan is going to be situated. You're going to have final loan approval, and you're going to have to remove that. These are called contingencies. Contingencies are something you can cancel the contract because of, and they all have dates attached to them, and they all run concurrently. So the appraisal contingency and the loan contingency are all running at the same time, along with later down the road, we're going to talk about inspection contingencies. So they all run concurrently. So you have to be aware of that. Contingencies keep running unless they're removed in writing. So keep that in mind. Then you're going to go down to buyer stated financing. If you decide to go from a conventional loan to an FHA loan, you are supposed to let the other side, the seller side, know that you're switching the type of loan you're getting. If you're, and number 4, if your buyer has a house to sell, and they can't buy this house until that house sold, then you need to check that box, and there's other forms that come and play with that. So you need to make sure you know what you're doing on those. That's a whole nother training session probably. The bottom under 7 is who pays for what. Okay, the who pays for what section. So traditionally in our area, the seller pays for a natural hazard zone disclosure report, and we have one of those partners at PMZ, Valley NHD. You can actually make that a permanent thing in all of your contracts, put it on your template, and you never have to type that in. If the buyer wants to ask the seller for any report, a pest report, a roof report, a pool report, whatever, you can put it there, but be aware, if you put a request for a report in a contract, the lender is going to want to see it. So let's say you ask for a pest report and there's $500 worth of work that has to be done, and the buyer and the seller agree that the buyer is going to do that afterwards because it's not a big deal. If you put that there's a pest report on your contract, be assured the lender's going to want to see it, and they may say, oh no, that has to be done prior to funding or prior to docs. So be very careful about putting requests for reports on your contract. Can open a can of worms. Down at the bottom, there's a box for who's going to make sure the smoke detector and carbon monoxide and the water heater strapping. Generally, that's a seller thing. So, and then make sure that your buyer signs at the bottom. On the next page, it talks about title and escrow. So in different areas, title and escrow are paid for differently. I'm in San Joaquin County. In San Joaquin County, generally, the buyer and the seller split that 50-50. In some areas, the seller pays all the title insurance. So you need to put in there who's going to pay for that and how it's going to be paid. So if you check both boxes, you need to put it's going to be paid 50-50 or half each, and put in a title company. Now, there is a rule that says if the seller picks the title company, the seller has to pay all of the title insurance. So be be aware of that. If you have pre-opened, that may trigger something that says, instead of, if you're in an area that goes 50-50 for title, that may obligate your seller to pay all of it. Depends on what the buyer puts in there. Just be aware of that. The next is other cost. The county transfer tax. Generally, the seller pays the county transfer tax. In our area, that's $1.10 on every $1,000 of the purchase price. So, which is not a lot of money. But if you go over to places like Berkeley and San Francisco, they can be $11, $12, $15 a thousand. So that's a lot of money. So you need to know what is usual and customary in the area you're working in. You need to know if there's a city transfer tax. There is a choice whether the buyer or seller pays for the HOA fee. Generally, the seller pays for that. There are some dock prep fees that the seller is required to pay by the civil code. There's not an option, and you see there's not a box to check there. So those are different things that you can check. Number 10 under that section is the home warranty. So when you're working on that, so either the seller pays for it, the buyer pays for it, they can split it half and half, and you need to put in a number there on not to exceed. So if you want them to get the platinum plan, the most expensive plan, you better figure out how much that is, because if the platinum plan is $600 and you only put $500 in there, the seller is only obligated by the contract to split the $500. And so there's $100 hanging out there somewhere. So who's going to pay for that? The title company will call and say, who's going to pay for the other $100 because you didn't put enough in there. If for some reason the buyer wants to waive and not ask for a home warranty, let's say it has all, they're going to gut the whole house. I just had one of those, and they intend to get rid of everything. They said, we're not going to pay for the home warranty because we're going to get rid of everything. You need to check the buyer waives the purchase of the home warranty. If you don't fill out anything in there, you're going to get a nasty little note from the Sky Slope checkers that says you have to put something there. You have to fill out another form, and we don't really need to fill out more forms than we already have. The next part is what items are included and excluded from the sale. So generally everything that's affixed to the property, ceiling fans, everything that's affixed to the property is included. A stove might be a freestanding stove. Refrigerators are considered personal property, so they might not be included, as well as washer and dryers. Even if it says in the MLS printout, the washer, dryer, and refrigerator is included, you need to put it in your contract. You need to mark it, because just because it says it in MLS printout is not a binding document. This is the contract you're going to use. This is what you're going to go off. So you need to put in there if you want those things or not. Then leased and lien systems, you need to check on those. If you see anything that's leased, if it's either solar, if it's leased, you need to deal with that. Liened solar systems are another whole issue, which we probably don't have time to talk about today, but you can talk about within your office. The next part is closing in possession. So it says the buyer does intend to occupy as the buyer's primary residence. If they're buying it for a rental, obviously you check the does not intend box under 9A. Otherwise, the buyer is intending to purchase this as their primary residence. Under B, this is when your buyer is going to get into their new house. So possession is going to be at 6 p.m. unless you put something else in there on the date escrow closes, or no later than X amount of calendar days after escrow closes. So if you really want to be the hero to your buyer, you won't make them wait until 6 p.m. on the date escrow closes to get into their new house, because you know that they're going to be parked out front of that house with their moving van ASAP that day and wanting to move in their house. So you can put 10 a.m. Now, of course, they wouldn't get possession of the house until it's actually recorded. So if it happens to be an afternoon recording, then that time frame wouldn't apply because it's not their house yet. So we're going to go on to page 4. It talks about selling remaining in possession after close of escrow, better known as the seller rent back. There's a form for that. And tenant occupied property, unless the buyer intends to use the property for a rental, be very careful about leaving tenants in there, especially nowadays. You can't hardly evict tenants because there's eviction moratoriums. So be very careful about leaving a tenant in a house that somebody intends to live in themselves. Okay. The next talks about statutory disclosures, disclosures that are required by law. There's lots of them that we use. We have forms for all of them. So it talks about those. Talks about natural and environmental hazards, withholding taxes. There's Megan's Law database disclosure. There's a website there. I tell buyers, you can go there and look at it and see, but don't tell me what you find out. Because if you sell this house and you find out there's a sex offender three streets over, if you sell another house, you have to disclose that. That's a material fact. So my husband always says, I'm going to go on and look and see if there's any sex offenders around our house. I always say, don't tell me what you find, because if I list my next door neighbor, I have to disclose that, right? And there's gas, hazardous liquid transmission pipelines. There's a website for that as well. It talks about condominiums, development disclosures. Those usually come from the HOA, which is a challenge sometimes. So, condition of property. The property is sold in its present physical condition. That's another way to say as is, on the date of acceptance, subject to buyer's investigation rights. So the buyer can have an inspection on anything they deem is important. And what's important to them may not be important to you. So you need to make sure that you go over, there's a pool. Maybe you should have a pool inspection. Oh, the roof. We don't know how old the roof is. Maybe you should have a roof inspection. Those are all, contingent on the buyer accepting the condition of the property, but you need to know what the condition is. And that's what 12 says. Buyer's investigation of property and matters affecting the property is a contingency of the agreement. So if the buyer finds out something about the property that they don't like and it can't be changed, that's a reason they can back out of this contract. Okay. There are time frames for that. So you have to be very cognizant of your time frames. The buyer cannot bring somebody on the property and do damage to the property while they're doing these inspections. So that's in the highlighted yellow part here. It talks about minimally invasive testing for a pest inspection. But you have to have the seller's prior written consent to bring any government building or zoning inspector or government employee on the property. Then under D, it says you can't put a lien on the property. If your inspections cause some kind of damage, you are responsible if the buyer is responsible for paying for those. So basically it's saying be very careful about who you have as your inspector. Make sure they have liability insurance. A lot of people say, well, my Uncle Joe was a contractor 25 years ago and he's going to come do my home inspection. Great. But what happens if Uncle Joe damaged something? What happens if he's in the attic and he falls through? So who's going to pay for the hole in the ceiling, and who's going to pay for that Uncle Joe got hurt? That's a problem. The next part is title investing. So there's different ways to hold title. As you can see down in 13D in all caps, it says the manner of taking title may have significant legal and tax consequences. Consult an appropriate professional. So you need to let your buyers be aware that when they sign their final paperwork, they're going to ask them how they want to take title. And there's different ways to do that. A lot of title companies have little handouts that you can give a buyer. And you are not, here's an important part. You are not an attorney and you are not a tax accountant. So don't give any legal advice or accounting advice unless you happen to be have one of those dual degrees. So it's not something that can't be changed later. So, because they'll look at you with this blank stare like, I don't know. So maybe have some of those handouts from the title company that you can give to somebody to help them decide down the road. On page 6, it talks about time periods for contingencies and cancellation rights. So we talked about those before. All these time periods are all running the same concurrently. So the seller has 7 days after acceptance to give you everything that they're responsible for. All the disclosures, the transfer disclosure statement, the seller property questionnaire, all the disclosures that they have to give out. You, the buyer, you represent the buyer, you have 17 days. Basically, the attorneys will tell you it's called the 17-day free look. I've heard Gov Hutchinson say that many times. So the buyer has 17 days to make sure they want to buy the house, to make sure they know everything about the house that's important to them, because remember, what's important to them may not be important to you, and the other way around. So after the 17 days, you need to remove those contingencies in writing. There's a form for that. And if you don't remove them, the seller could send you a document that's called a notice to perform and ask you to remove those contingencies. If you don't remove them, they keep right on running. And for a seller, that's dangerous, because that gives the buyer an added way to get out of the contract, even to the very end, if they're not removed. So pay attention to your time frames. The next part talks about how a contract can get canceled. So if you don't perform on something, let's say you don't remove the contingency, the seller's going to give the buyer a notice to perform. They have to give you a time. They have to give you 3 days. If you don't respond to that, and if you don't perform what they're asking, let's say in this case it's removal of the inspection contingency, and they give you the notice to perform, it's after 3 days, and you don't remove it, they can arbitrarily cancel this contract. They don't have to have your approval, because you did not respond and you did not remove the contingency. So, and with the same way, if the seller doesn't perform and give you all the documentation that you need, you can give the seller a notice to perform and say, hey, I'm going to move on if you don't give me what all these documents that I need. So just be aware that could happen. Now, they also can if you don't close escrow in time, you can also get a form that's called a demand to close escrow. Okay? So the demand to close escrow is a specific demand, not related to contingencies. But if you don't close escrow, the seller can give you a demand to close escrow. They can't give it to you any earlier than 3 days before the close of escrow. So let's say they can't give you a demand to close escrow a week before you're supposed to close escrow. They can only give it to you 3 days before you're supposed to close escrow. If they only give it to you on the day you're supposed to close escrow, you have 3 more days to close. But if you don't close, again, they can arbitrarily cancel the contract. Now, if you don't perform on your contingency, they have to give you your deposit back, the earnest money deposit that was on the first page. So the deposit's not in play at that point. Okay? It's talking about effective cancellation on deposits. Now, if you cancel a contingency, let's say you cancel all the contingencies, and 10 days before you're supposed to close, the buyer finds their dream house and it's not this one, and they want to go back buy the new house, not the one they currently have the offer on. Well, they could go do that. They could cancel, but they risk their deposit money up to 3% of the sale price as damages to the seller. The seller potentially could keep that deposit. And I always say potentially, because you're not an attorney, so you're not supposed to be giving illegal advice. So I always say potentially could keep the deposit. That's if the contingencies are removed. So the next part is on page 7, final verification of condition. That's the final walkthrough, okay? And that's done within 5 days prior to escrow. And you'll notice in there, it's not a contingency of the sale. So this is not another walkthrough to say, oh, we want you to fix this or we want you to fix that. This is the time for two things. It's to make sure that the property is in the same condition it was when you bought it. So they haven't let the lawn die or the pole go green. And number two, if they in fact agreed to make any repairs on your request for repairs, that those have been done. So if it's something, let's say, that you can't actually see, something in the attic, let's say, you could use a receipt from a tradesperson to verify that it has actually been done. So that's the only two reasons you're doing this walkthrough. The next talks about repairs. Repairs have to be have to be completed prior to close of escrow. Talks about prorations of property taxes. This is very confusing. Whoever thought this up was on crack. So the tax year goes from July 1 to June 30th. And you pay your taxes in December for the half of the year starting in July to December. And you pay them in April for the half of the year starting in January to June. So either you're paying them, depending on the time of year you're closing in, you could be paying them in ahead or behind. So they're going to prorate the property taxes in escrow according to what the seller currently pays. You need to make your buyer aware that they will probably get a supplemental tax bill for the difference between what the seller currently pays on and what they're buying the house on. So let's say the seller currently pays on $300,000 and the buyer's buying the house for $400,000. The supplemental tax bill is going to get sent to them for $100,000 for the time in between. So it's not going to be a whole tax years, but they will get that tax bill. And for buyers that are having their taxes impounded, that tax bill is not, the supplemental tax bill does not go to your lender. It comes to the buyer alone. So you need to let them know so that if they get it, when they get it, they know they have to pay it. Now, a buyer could call their lender and ask them if there's enough in their impound account to cover that, because sometimes the lenders do, they know they're going to get that supplemental tax bill, so they collect extra and they might have a reserve. But also what happens is during that time frame, that supplemental tax bill could take up to a year to come. The lender can only keep so much in their escrow account for so long. And they may send them back a refund check because they audit the account and then they have to send them money back. If they send them money back, that's probably the money for their supplemental taxes. So tell them, if you get a refund from your lender, don't spend it, because that's probably your supplemental tax money. So it talks about compensation in 18, scope of duties. So it's letting people know that, we're not obligated to crawl in the attic and crawl underneath. We are obligated to visually inspect the home. We're not electricians, we're not tax accountants, we're not attorneys. It tells them what our scope of duty is. All right. Next is representative capacity if they're signing for a trust or something. Number 20 is joint escrow instructions. So these escrow instructions go to the title company, and that's what the title company uses to make up the escrow instructions at the end. Okay, so if you change something in this contract, let's say you decide to give a credit or you decide to change the close of escrow date, you're obviously going to have something signed by all parties for that. So you need to send that to the title company. Anything that makes a change in the contract needs to go to the title company so they have that, so they know how to process and change the final escrow instructions. On page 8, there's 2 paragraphs here. They're in big letters, bold letters, meaning they're important. These two, they're liquidated damages and arbitration. You'll notice that there are initials for both parties. If for some reason both parties don't initial that paragraph, it is not part of the contract. So you have to pay very close attention when you're signing this page, because a lot of buyers, they're excited, they're talking, and you have a husband and a wife or two parties, and one of them might miss initialing in all those places, because there's 3 places to initial on this. So liquidated damages basically means if your buyer defaults on the contract, if they in fact find their dream house and they don't want to buy this house anymore, and you've released all those contingencies, they're going to risk possibly their deposit. The seller wanting to keep their deposit, they can only keep up to 3% of the purchase price. And if you're going to make a $5,000 deposit on a $300,000 house, they're going to, probably keep the most. They're going to keep all of it, or they could potentially keep all of it. So if you represent the buyer, when you get this contract back, you need to check those 2 paragraphs and make sure the seller initialed those. And if they didn't, you need to call the other agent and ask them if it was a mistake or if they did it on purpose, because that's very important when it comes down to the end. So the next part talks about dispute resolution. So everybody agrees in the contract to mediation. So mediation is not binding. We have actually mediators at the Lodi Association of Realtors that are trained by the Pepperdine Mediation School. So we do have that service that you can take advantage of if you can't work it out prior to, going that far. Usually it can be worked out within the agents and the offices and all that. But if you have to go to mediation, I've gone to mediation one time. It is not binding. Basically, you go and each person gives their thing and gives their reason why they're not agreeable. And the mediators, which aren't necessarily know anything about real estate, say we think you should do this. Well, the parties can say, okay, or no, I'm not going to do that. So if any of that fails and the B paragraph is initialed by both parties, you go to arbitration. So what the attorneys will tell you is, you're not a liar. Don't explain arbitration. It's in big, bold letters, but it's in our contract. So the people are going to look at you like, well, what is that? So I always tell people, I'm not a liar. I can't tell you all the ins and outs of arbitration, but here's what I know. It's quicker and cheaper if you do arbitration rather than going to full-blown court to resolve your dispute. So if you initial this and the other person initials this, you're basically agreeing to binding arbitration. And a lot of people have had bad experiences with binding arbitration. They do binding arbitration in labor disputes. So you may have somebody that doesn't want to sign it. So you should never force them. But don't give them advice about it either. So that is arbitration and liquidated damages. So we're going to go on to page 9. And not a lot on this to be filled out. You will see that on number 29, it says nothing in the contract can be changed in any way, shape, or form unless it's signed in writing by both parties. So let's say on that first page you put in the escrow period, instead of putting 30 days, you put 45 days or sooner. Well, it's 45 days unless both parties agree to the or sooner. So because they have to agree to the or sooner part. So if you can't be agreed upon, it's whatever's written in the contract. Then paragraph 30 covers definitions of the contract. Probably the most important one is G, days after. There's a lot of things in the contract that happen so many days after something else happens. So many days after acceptance. So days after is counted. The day something happens is not day 1, it's day 0. So if you have 17 days after acceptance to do all your inspections and investigations, the day of acceptance is day 0. The next day is day 1, and the next day is day 2, and you count from there. So The day something happens is not day 1, it's day 0. Very important because everybody needs to be on the same page. So down under 31, you're going to put expiration of offer. If you don't put anything in there, your offer expires in 3 days. If you know there's going to be lots of offers and you would really like not to have so many, you could put a shorter time frame in there. But be aware that the seller may say, I'm not going to review any offers until Monday, and it's Wednesday. So if that's what the seller says, that's all the other agent can do. But technically your offer would be expired after the time you put in there. So then you will have your buyer's sign at the bottom there. The next page is page 10. That's where if you used, hang on.